I want you to imagine walking down a street in a British city in 1750. The houses are elegant, Georgian brick, well-proportioned, the kind of architecture that still gets photographed today. But as you look up at the facades, something is wrong, something you can't immediately name, and then you see it. Windows, bricked up, sealed shut, blank rectangles of stone where glass should be, house after house with its eyes closed, as if someone went down the street and decided one by one to erase the light. You're looking at the physical scar of one of the most extraordinary taxes in history. A tax not on income, not on land, not on goods, a tax on windows, which was effectively a tax on light, on air, on the simple human desire to see outside. And here is the twist I want to save for the middle of this episode. The most famous phrase this tax supposedly gave us, a phrase you almost certainly know, turns out to be something historians quietly argue it didn't give us at all. I'm Alexandra, welcome to the hidden life of things, everyday history for anyone who's ever looked at something ordinary and wondered, how did this actually get here? To understand the window tax, you need to understand a very specific political problem that governments in the late 17th century were grappling with. They needed money. To be fair, governments always need money, but the particular challenge in late 17th century England was this: how do you tax wealth without asking people how much they have? The concept of declaring your personal income to the government was, at this point, considered deeply offensive, almost a violation of a gentleman's privacy. The idea that the crown could demand to know what you earned, peer into your accounts, assess your affairs, was genuinely seen as tyrannical. People who would cheerfully pay a duty on wine or leather would balk furiously at an income tax. So governments had to find what we now call proxy taxes. Taxes on visible, measurable things that correlated with wealth without requiring anyone to open their books. In 1696, the English government under King William III was in a particular financial crisis. The Great Recoinage, a massive, expensive program to replace debased coins that had been clipped and shaped by counterfeiters, had drained the treasury. They needed revenue urgently, and they needed it in a way that would seem fair. The solution someone arrived at was elegant in its logic and brutal in its consequences. Rich people live in large houses. Large houses have many windows, because glass was expensive and lots of windows was a mark of prosperity and architectural ambition. Poor people live in small cottages with few windows because they can't afford more. Therefore, tax windows. The more windows you have, the more you pay. No need to ask anyone what they earn, just count the windows. The tax was structured in bands. Initially, houses with fewer than 10 windows paid nothing, just a flat rate. Houses with 10 to 20 windows paid more. Houses with more than 20 paid most. The thresholds were adjusted several times over the tax's long history. By the 18th century, even houses with more than 6 windows were being taxed. It seemed, on paper, like a reasonable, progressive tax. In practice, it became something quite different. The first and most immediate consequence was that people started blocking up their windows. Not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily over years and decades across England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, property owners began filling in window openings with brick or stone, not because they didn't want the light, but because they didn't want the tax bill. Some filled them permanently, others filled them temporarily, breaking them up before a tax assessor's visit and reopening them afterwards, which was a reasonably common practice and must have been an extraordinary sight if you happened to visit at the right moment. New houses were sometimes designed and built with false window shapes, the outline of a window, the architectural proportions of a window, but no glass. Blind windows, they were called. A house that looked symmetrical and well windowed from the outside, but inside was darker than it needed to be. And here is where the consequences move from financial inconvenience to genuine public health crisis. Ventilation in the 18th and early 19th centuries was one of the primary mechanisms people understood for preventing disease. This wasn't germ theory, that came later, but it was empirically correct that dark, airless, crowded spaces were associated with sickness, typhus, tuberculosis. The diseases that killed the greatest numbers of the urban poor spread most effectively in exactly the conditions the window tax created: sealed, dark, poorly ventilated rooms. In Edinburgh, where the tax was enforced from 1748 onwards, the effects were particularly severe in the crowded tenement buildings of the Old Town. These were multi-story buildings where many families shared a staircase and where windows were already few. When landlords, because the tax fell on occupiers but could easily be passed through rents, chose to brick windows to reduce costs, entire families lost their light and air. Physicians and social reformers began speaking out against the tax in the late 18th century with increasing urgency. The Scottish social reformer and physician Thomas Young wrote in 1845 that the window tax was a tax on health, on comfort, on cleanliness. He was not alone. Parliamentary debates from the early 19th century are full of impassioned speeches describing the health consequences of light-deprived homes. The tax was also deeply unequal in practice, despite its elegant theory. Wealthy homeowners could absorb the cost while their tenants got darker homes. Large commercial property owners were often exempt or could negotiate assessments, and there were genuine absurdities. Bakers who needed windows in their shops for ventilation were taxed on them. Farmers whose barns had ventilation openings sometimes found those assessed as windows. The tax was hated, genuinely, widely, bitterly hated, and it lasted, despite the protests, for 155 years. In 1851, after decades of campaigning by public health reformers, including those whose arguments were directly tied to the emerging understanding of disease transmission, the windows tax was finally repealed. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. People threw open their bricked-up windows. New buildings began incorporating glass with abandon. The Victorians, freed from the light tax, went on to build the Crystal Palace, an entire exhibition hall made of glass and iron, in that same year. The timing is not a coincidence. Now, the twist I promised you. You have almost certainly heard the phrase daylight robbery. You use it, probably, to describe anything outrageously overpriced, a parking charge, a hotel minibar, a tourist area coffee. And you may well have heard, because it is repeated constantly in books, in tour guides, in television programs, that this phrase comes from the window tax. That the tax was literally a robbery of daylight, and that the outraged English people gave the language this lasting expression of their fury. It's a wonderful story. It's neat, it's satisfying, it connects the tax to the present day, it puts a verbal monument in everyday language to a real injustice. The problem is that linguistic historians don't support it. The phrase daylight robbery does not appear in print until 1916 in Harold Brighthouse's play Hobson's Choice. The Oxford English Dictionary's first citation is 1949. The window tax was repealed in 1851. There is a gap of at least 65 years between the end of the tax and the first documented use of the phrase, which is extremely difficult to explain if one caused the other. More significantly, the phrase doesn't actually refer to daylight specifically. Daylight in this sense most likely means in broad daylight, meaning an act so brazen it's committed openly in plain sight without even the cover of darkness, which is a different metaphor entirely. Highway robbery committed on open roads in daylight is the older related phrase, and the logic is the same. So, did the window tax give us the phrase daylight robbery? Almost certainly not. No reputable linguistic authority supports the connection. Does this make the window tax less interesting? I'd argue it makes it more so, because the phrase doesn't need the tax to be a good story. The tax is extraordinary on its own. And the fact that we invented a linguistic legacy for it, that we wanted it to have left this mark on the language, says something interesting about how we mythologize history. We reach for neat connections. We want the injustice to have left a scar we can still touch. The window tax left real scars in the architecture of towns across Britain and Ireland, in the mortality rates of the urban poor, in the design of Victorian buildings. It doesn't need a phrase that probably isn't connected to it. The bricked-up windows are still there, in Edinburgh, in Bath, in London, in Dublin. If you know what you're looking for, you can walk down a Georgian street and read the tax in the stonework. That's a more honest monument than a phrase. Britain was not alone in this. France introduced its own window and door tax in 1798, the Contribution des portes et fenêtres, which operated on similar principles and produced similar effects. Bricked-up windows appeared in French towns and cities for the same reasons. The French tax lasted even longer. It wasn't repealed until 1926. Buildings in French cities still carry its mark. Other European countries introduced versions of the same idea. The underlying logic, use visible architectural features as proxies for wealth, was appealing to governments across the continent that faced the same political resistance to income disclosure. But the story of the window tax connects to something larger that I think is worth pausing on. Every building is a record of the rules that govern the people who built it. Architecture is not just aesthetic. It is law made visible. The blind windows of Georgian Edinburgh are the window tax. The low ceilings of certain medieval buildings reflect the taxes on building height that operated in some cities. The narrow frontages of canal house buildings in Amsterdam reflect property taxes levied on street front width, which is why those beautiful Dutch houses are so narrow and so tall. The dimensions of staircases in Paris buildings reflect regulations about what counted as a taxable room. When you walk through any old city, you're walking through a manuscript of legislation. The window specifically has been a site of political and philosophical contestation for a remarkably long time. The idea that light and air are public goods, that a person has a right to them, that a government which taxes them is overstepping, drove reformers and philosophers across the 18th and 19th century. John Stuart Mill's arguments about individual liberty were partly shaped by debate about exactly these kinds of proxy taxes on basic human necessities. And today, we don't pay a window tax, but we do live in a world where natural light in homes is still unevenly distributed by wealth, where planning regulations determine how much sky you can see from your window, where energy-efficient glazing carries its own tax incentives and penalties, where the difference between a bedroom with natural light and one without can add tens of thousands to a property's value. The sun is still not entirely free. We've just changed the mechanism. The next time you look out of a window, especially in an old building, especially in Britain or Ireland or France, consider the possibility that the proportions of that window were negotiated, not just designed. That someone somewhere made a calculation about how much light was worth paying for. And somewhere down the street, someone else decided it wasn't. So the next time you walk down a Georgian street and spot a stretch of brick where a window should be, or the next time you call something daylight robbery, knowing now that the connection is almost certainly a myth, take a moment. The bricked-up windows are still there. They're one of the most literal things in history, the shape of a tax pressed into stone. A record of what people were willing to give up to avoid paying the government for the right to see outside. We think of taxes as numbers on a form, but sometimes they rearrange the physical world. They change what buildings look like, they change how much light gets in, and the light you take for granted today in your home through your windows, someone in another century chose to live without. History isn't only in museums. Sometimes it's in the blank spaces where windows used to be. If today's episode made you see something ordinary a little differently, that's exactly what this podcast is for. You can find The Hidden Life of Things on all the usual podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you listen. If you enjoyed it, a follow or a review costs nothing and means everything. Perhaps share it with someone who looks at old buildings and wonders about them. They'll be glad you did. Next time on The Hidden Life of Things, we're going to talk about a flower. One single flower that in a very specific time and place was worth more than a house. And the story of why is stranger and more honest than you think. Stay curious. I'm Alexandra, and I'll talk to you next week.